It is my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Bolz. He is a PhD candidate. Many of you know him. He's a PhD candidate in learning sciences, and he is preparing to defend his work in the coming weeks. With a background in teaching composition in English at the secondary and post-secondary levels, his current research focuses on examining historical reasoning during the composition process, which stemmed from his work on Project Ready at LSRI. Michael currently serves as school board president in Thornton Fractional District 215 and has been serving on that board for over 10 years, I believe.
Yep.
Please join me in welcoming Michael Bolz.
As with every good research project, this was funded by IES, and I wanted to acknowledge that this study was situated within Project Ready. So that was the large multi-institutional research project funded by IES that supports students' disciplinary literacy and evidence-based argumentation in a bunch of different disciplines. And so they were the benevolent overlord of this study that was done back in 2016 when data collection took place. So just to give you a quick overview or a top level look at the project, the overall purpose of the current study has been to examine and better understand how students draw on their historical reasoning processes during the writing process, and then compare that reasoning that's evident in the composing process to the evidence of the reasoning in the students' essays that they produced. So this study adopted a multiple case study design, and I used concurrent think aloud protocols with 8 participants as they composed historical essays, which required them to use multiple sources to compile that essay. So a document-based question, or a DBQ, if any of you are familiar with those. So the questions this study sought to answer are really, how are the students reasoning historically as they compose? So what does that look like? And then how does this reasoning compare to the reasoning that can be inferred from their essays? So the purpose of today's talks, for the purposes, I'm going to kind of rather move quickly through some of the major components of the study, including some background on historical thinking and reasoning, talk about my methods, of course, my findings. Hopefully I'll spend the most time discussing the findings today, and then we'll get to the good stuff, the cases themselves, and some discussion. So first, just a broad look at the research on historical thinking and reasoning. And I just want to point out, a lot of the images you're going to see, most of the images you're going to see are from artifacts from the participants in my study. So in the background here, you're actually looking at an outline that one of my students produced in preparation for the essay. So it happened somewhere between them reading sources and writing the essay. So first, a look at what historical thinking and reasoning is. So in the discipline of history, when historians engage in their discipline, they move between questions about the past and use evidence from the past to construct interpretations. So in doing so, they use sources from the historical record as evidence to create and support their arguments. So I like to cite the historian and historiographer Peter Gale. I think he was a Dutch historian who argued that history is argument without end, or that a historian's judgment will have no finality. So in other words, this is all tentative. It is a discipline that is meant to be negotiated and argued over. And it's also important to point out here that the historical record itself, from which historians work with, is also very incomplete, inconsistent, and tentative in nature. So it's tentative in that new information can be learned or discovered that changes our understanding of the historical record. So for example, maybe 100 years from now, when Trump's full tax returns are disclosed, maybe that'll change our understanding of the present. Just kidding, we already know, So to construct these interpretations of the past, theoretical and empirical studies of how experts operate in the discipline of history and show that historians engage in a variety of reasoning processes to do history, right? So as historians do history, they're engaging in a variety of processes. A lot of people are very familiar with Weinberg's 1991 study. It's a seminal expert novice study in which he examined what historians do and what students do as they read historical sources. And he was the one to really first talk about three what he called historical thinking heuristics that historians use to support their reading and understanding of sources. So those are sourcing, contextualization, and corroboration. So historians, they engage in sourcing, or they source documents when they examine and question the authors of sources and their biases. They also contextualize by then situating the document in time and space. And they also corroborate by drawing connections and comparisons within and across historical sources. It's funny, usually when I'm talking in person, I'm doing a lot of like hand gestures. And so I'm finding that I'm moving my hands like right in front of my face to interact, because I'm so used to running around the room when I give talks. It's important to note here that these processes are not mutually exclusive processes. So, for example, sourcing is one of those processes that stands out as foundational for historical reasoning. So, as in, engagement in other historical processes such as contextualization are dependent on sourcing. So as I'm trying to think about the author of a source and why he wrote it, I'm also pulling in historical details and background to situate it in time and space. And so that's dependent a lot on sourcing processes. As well, I want to underscore the importance of prior historical knowledge for a moment for historical reasoning. So a lot of the research literature talks about how important these processes are for students and for experts to do the discipline of history. But historians and students just don't engage in these reasoning processes carte blanche. They actually bring bodies of background knowledge with them to their work. So in the experts' case, in historians' cases, they typically bring a rich body of background that's really well organized, that they can apply to the situations or sources or history that they're working with at any given moment. And for students, that's not so much the case. So I'd also note that, or argue that, the role of prior knowledge in historical reasoning hasn't garnered, I don't think, a lot of attention in the research literature. It's clear that it's very important for reasoning, though, such as contextualization. It's definitely understood that it's important, but it's not so clear that, not a lot of research has specifically attended to students or experts' prior knowledge in studies of historical reasoning. So one of the important studies, I think it was Van Dree and Van Boxtel, noted at the bottom here in 2012, they demonstrated the importance of prior historical knowledge in a study when they found that students really needed that background knowledge to effectively engage in some of the reasoning processes they were trying to elicit. So that's kind of like an overview of the experts kind of look at what we know about historical thinking and reasoning, but those aren't the only processes at play. In addition to the big three, so to speak, those heuristics of sourcing, contextualization, and corroboration, research in the field has also identified really a range of additional facets of what historians do as they engage in history. So I'm not going to take the time to exhaustively describe that range now or talk about all the frameworks that are out there, but I do want to highlight really some of the processes that are most pertinent to the present study. So one of those is historical comparisons. So historians make direct comparisons between two or more events or historical actors or periods or sources. And so that includes the recognition of similarities and differences among historical documents. So, looking at multiple sources and trying to make sense of them, comparing them, and then making an argument from those. Use of historical frameworks, so through which history is viewed and interpreted. So A lot of people think of the typical social, economic, and political frameworks. It's important to distinguish that these can also be organizing frameworks. Some people, students especially, like to organize their historical essays around social, political, and economic differences because it's kind of ingrained in them. But these are also interpretive frameworks from which we can view history. So we can look at the Civil War, for instance, and interpret it through an economic lens, for instance, versus a political lens of the time. We can view it through those frameworks. Two others to note: historical perspective taking. So that is the ability to view or attend to the perspective, or sorry, I'm going to let someone else into the meeting. The ability to view or attend to the perspective of the author or historical actor of a source. So what was the what was that person's goals for writing that source? What is the purpose, and what were they trying to accomplish, for instance? What were they thinking? And then chronology and periodization are two additional processes I wanted to mention, which really involves recognizing or attending to the time and ordering of events or sources or historical actors in relationship to one another. And then periodization is a little bit different. It's very closely related to chronological reasoning. But periodization is recognizing or attending to discrete units of time in history. So we can think of the Ice Age, for instance. That's a kind of a poor example, but it is an age that we think of as a discrete unit of time in history. We can also think about periods like of American expansion, manifest destiny. You can kind of create periods around those things, and historians use those to describe and capture what they're trying to argue. So one kind of last note I want to mention here, since I am afforded the time during this talk and not necessarily, I won't have as much time when I do my dissertation defense, but I wanted to mention that I use the term historical reasoning here, and I'm being intentional about it because there's a whole body of research literature where some people characterize these things as heuristics in the classroom, like we can create sourcing heuristics. Weinberg called them historical heuristics. Some people can categorize them as skills to be learned. Others categorize them as reasoning processes. And so I just want to be clear that I am referring to skills, practices, dispositions that historians and students engage in when they participate in the discipline of history. So they're using sources to create interpretations of the past, and these are the things we want them to be able, these are the things that they employ to be able to accomplish those ends. So I guess I have to hit the space part of advance. So turning from kind of the expert work to students now, I want to note that I think Weinberg said it best in 2002 when he said, historical thinking is not a natural act for students. And so what is clear is that research has established that students do not spontaneously just do these things. They don't spontaneously engage in historical reasoning, and they indeed require a variety of supports to think historically. However, the good news is there has been a large body of initiatives which has sought to support that and support students' historical reasoning. And from this body, we have learned that a range of strategies can be used to improve students in this area, including explicitly teaching strategy, explicit strategy instruction, modeling of historical reasoning and reading practices, guided practice, fading of structured supports, and on Project Ready in particular, in which the context for the present study, instructional interventions were designed to support students' historical inquiry, and students engaged in historical reasoning by using sources in the classroom all the time to ask and answer questions about the past, and then construct their own interpretive arguments about the events they're learning about in the class. And they did this not only in writing, but they did it in discussions, they did it in small groups. It was modeled for them, and that this occurred throughout the academic year. So does writing factor into all this? Because again, I'm looking at how students wrote history. So, well, we've learned from historians that we've learned that historians' writing differs from novices in pretty stark ways. So, as historians write, they again employ a variety of skills and background knowledge to read and reread source documents, and then they synthesize that information into the writing, and they draw on both reading and writing skills to create and negotiate all those interpretations of the past that usually end up in a journal article or maybe a book. Whereas students tend to knowledge tell. That is, they tend to regurgitate knowledge and facts when asked to write in history. Whereas historians, they make novel connections among the knowledge they interpret and the sources they interpret. So to move students towards that knowledge transformation, they must be able to reason with the sources that they read and move past general comprehension and just retelling of what they already knew. We need to move them towards these reasoning processes to allow them to produce solid evidence-based arguments with multiple sources. So as such, research has shown that, again, the explicit teaching of historical writing skills can improve history learning outcomes and students' reasoning. Montesano's 2010 study was one of the kind of seminal ones in that regard. She found that students' historical reasoning and writing quality and content learning improved when you explicitly taught students reasoning strategies, a strategy instruction alongside how to write in history. So there were writing supports as well. What we've also learned is that the way you prompt students to engage in historical writing impacts the reasoning that they demonstrate and the quality of the writing. So, for example, if you prompt students to evaluate for instance, the trustworthiness of a source or refer to the purpose for which it was written, students are more likely to demonstrate that process, to demonstrate sourcing. If you prompt them to attend to a historical opinion, they're more likely to create, to engage and create an opinion. So what we know is that the way we ask the questions in history, both in classrooms and in research, impact the types of reasoning that you're going to see in students' written products. So to cut to the chase here, writing is one of those core practices in the discipline of history, and it's central to a lot of classrooms in which students are historically thinking and reasoning. Writing is central to how historians do their work. Again, history is a literate discipline. Historians write almost every day, and we want students to be able to articulate their reasoning, their thinking in history classrooms in their writing as well. It is something we expect and we want students to be able to do. And so the research literature is also clear that it is not easy to use historical writing to assess students' historical reading. It's hard to see. However, researchers and teachers both have heavily relied on the essay itself, evidence in the form of students' written work. So they're source-based essays to make claims about how students about students' ability to reason historically. In fact, recent articles, including, I believe, the chapter that I provided for the Journal Club students today that they were to read in advance of today's talk, is one of those articles or one of those chapters that claim that students' essays may hold the most promise to effectively assess students' historical thinking and reasoning. And to that end, these claims are not without merit. However, it is not clear whether and how the historical reasoning students engage in to write an essay comes to be represented in that essay. So does the process resemble the product that they produce? And that leads me to my study. What does the historical composing process look like? And when you compare it to the essay, does the essay provide an accurate picture of the student's historical reasoning. And so just in the big bullet here, this study examines how students engaged in historical reasoning during the composition process, and then it compares that reasoning to the evidence of reasoning in their essays. So as I mentioned, the study was situated within the context of Project Ready, which was a research project focused on designing and testing of inquiry-based instructional interventions. The Ready team designed instructional approaches that focused on investigating evidence-based arguments with multiple texts in history. And sure, I guess they also did some work in science and literature as well, but they really didn't have as much fun as the history team. And so I'm focusing on the history team and the work of historians today. And this is one of those situations in where a live audience really helps, because I would imagine there'd be uproarious laughter at this point. But oh, there we go. Thank you. But within the history design team, there was a collaboration of researchers, of historians, teacher educators, and brilliant graduate assistants, and of course, teachers. The teacher's role is important to underscore because they were an integral part of the design process and work that we were doing in collaboration and partnership with them. And so the history design team, as I mentioned, designed for historical inquiry with an emphasis on students' historical reasoning. Again, in Ready history classrooms, students would use primary, secondary, and tertiary historical sources. So they'd use textbooks as a reference point, but they would use primary source documents to examine and ask and answer questions about the past that they were learning about. And then they would create interpretive arguments about these historical events. And it was actually an emergent finding during the work on this team and this project that led me towards this current study. It was clear from other sources of data that students were indeed doing some of these things that we wanted them to do. They were demonstrating some sophisticated sourcing and corroboration across sources and contextualization from background knowledge, but they weren't necessarily doing it when we sat them down in front of a writing task. Instead, we saw it in their, again, their discussions, their group work, the annotations of their primary sources. And so that led me to, with my background in composition, that really led me to want to investigate kind of this problem space itself a little further. So I want to take a little time here to talk about the research design and approach for my study. And in my kind of abstract of the talk, I promised I would unpack this a little further. So there were some, I would call, methodological conundrums that I approached as I attempted to dive into a very rich qualitative data set. So the study was embedded within a classroom where the goals were explicitly to teach students how to engage in historical inquiry. It was a Ready classroom. And specifically the cooperating teacher, the partnering teacher, her pseudonym in my study is Miss Johnson. Her classes were designed around and driven by the Ready history learning goals that were intended to promote students' ability to read and reason and do historical inquiry. As well as I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but she provided structured scaffolds for writing historical arguments and DBQs during across the school year, but really during the first semester of the year, so that by the end of the academic year, students could write these essays on their own without a lot of academic support, all in preparation for this AP exam in which they would have to compose one of these document-based questions on the final AP exam. So the emphasis in her classroom, in the Ready classroom, on reading, reasoning, and writing like a historian made this course, I think, a really good site for exploring students' historical reasoning in the context of the writing, especially when I wanted to see their historical reasoning in their essays and in the process itself. So data collection for my study took place actually in the spring of 2016, before there was a pandemic, and when we could move about the cabin as we wished. And this was in the timeline of Project Ready, this was after the more intense design iterations were complete. So by the time of study, most of the regular data collections in her classroom had ceased. However, I was in the classroom about 8 or 9 times prior to the study in the spring of 2016 to do occasional visits with the teacher, really to maintain the relationship as well, to consent students and to do occasional observational visits. So I think I alluded to this at the very top, but this study was a multiple case study design that used concurrent think aloud protocols to investigate students' historical reasoning that they engage in to produce an essay. So concurrent meaning they really talked aloud, thought aloud from soup to nuts, from when they were given the task to when they completed the task and finished the essay. The DBQ that was selected or identified for use in this study was one that the partnering teacher had all of her students, she was planning to have all her students work on during the AP review period for the AP exam. So again, data collection was in April. This was right at the beginning of when classroom instruction really focused to reviewing each of the historical periods across American history in preparation for their exam. And so she was planning to already have them, the students, write this essay or this question in class. And so while the students were actually writing it, my participants were pulled from the class, and I did a Think Aloud training session with those students to give them a little bit of experience of what it's like to try to talk aloud as you read and as you write, and do something that's kind of a stressful task. So for of the 3 sections of AP US History that Ms. Johnson taught, the largest section and the section with the greatest number of consented students was the section I selected as the focal section of the class, just to increase the likelihood of identifying an adequate number of participants for the study. And as you can see, these are all pseudonyms, but I have 8 different students, 8 different cases of students here: Rachel, Jay, Hannah, Grace, Mary, Yancy, and Randall, and Haley, that you'll be introduced to a little more in a few moments here. So just to give you an idea of the sources of data I used, here's hopefully my first typo in my slides. There were 3 video records of each participant's Think Aloud sessions. My primary sources of data were the video records of the protocol sessions, the corresponding transcripts that I created from those video sessions. I also had post-task Think Alouds, the post-task interview questions. So 2 questions that I asked each of the participants after they were done. I also used their completed essay as an important source of the data, and then my field notes that I took during the session. So call it researcher preparedness, or you can call it paranoia, but I actually used 3 different video recorders to capture the sessions. One was positioned over the shoulder of the participant, like behind them, a little bit further. It wasn't too like nerve-wracking, but it was over their shoulder to try to capture what they were doing with their pen on the papers. One was capturing from the side, and then a third camera was positioned on the table. So in the photo on the slide, you can see a little GoPro, a battery-operated GoPro setup on the table, positioned downward toward the participants' papers to capture the students' real-time composition. And again, this was probably paranoia, but I was really terrified that this was my only opportunity to collect data before the academic year was over, and time was of the essence. And I was really afraid that one of these cameras would fail. And in fact, I'm very glad this turned out to be a priceless resource, especially the little GoPro footage, because it verified some very bad audio that came from one of the main cameras. And it was also really useful in pinpointing when students were inscribing specific things into their essay. Like, did they actually draft that? Did they cross it out? Did they revise? Like, what was going on in their composing process? And so I just want to make that methodological note. One could argue that that would perhaps hinder students or make them more nervous during an already stressful task. And I believe students were already really accustomed to having a camera in the room. The training session was audio recorded, so they were used to having recorders in front of them during small group sessions. So I really don't think the participants that volunteered for my study would have been affected by this. But so again, the typo is there were 3 video records of each participant, 2 that were mainly used during data analysis. So just to briefly introduce you to the writing task that was used, certainly if you all are experts in American history, you might be familiar with some of these sources, or if you ever took AP US history, this might, I don't know, give you flashbacks or some PTSD. But this prompt was from the 1993 DBQ that the College Board rewrote for use for practice in AP history classrooms. And the prompt itself was a comparative prompt. Students were asked to draw on their reasoning skills to compare and contrast the development of 2 early colonies in US history. So the New England colony and the Chesapeake regions, 2 regions prior to the date of 1700. And then they were asked to explain the reasons why they developed differently, in similar and different ways. So they were provided 7 different documents. Again, this was a practice document-based question that the teacher had selected for everyone to use in preparation for the exam. And the source set was composed of 7 excerpted primary sources. And I want to emphasize excerpted because all of these sources were much longer sources that are edited down and tailored for this task. So 3 of the sources circled in blue here were addressed issues in the New England colony. And then the last 4 spoke to the development of the Virginia colony. And so I won't introduce these in too much detail here. I think you'll get familiar with them as I kind of discuss them in the context of the students' findings. So after the video records were transcribed, formatted into transcripts, they were parsed into an adequate grain size for the analysis. And at that point, the analyses really fell into 3 phases. The first phase of analysis aimed at really just getting familiar with the data, describing how the students move through the composing process. So in this step, I identified really the salient reading and writing activities in the process data. So for example, if the student was reading the prompt or reading or rereading a particular document, or if they were planning the essay or writing or revising the essay, that would be denoted. Again, in this phase, both sources were initially coded for historical reasoning processes, which was informed by the literature. So this was not what you would characterize as an open coding situation where you go in and just see what's there. It was informed by the expert and extant literature in historical reasoning. So I call it an initial coding. I think Karmaz, if I'm pronouncing that right, talks about that. So the essays, conversely, were coded for their argument structure. So I identified the claims in the essays, the evidence and documents students were using in the essays, and their reasoning, as well as just some of the general features in the essay corpus. And then historical reasoning codes were refined in the second phase. That those initial codes that I had used in the first phase were iteratively refined and then applied to both sources of data independently of each other. So then for each case, that is each student, a comparative analysis of the reasoning that was viewable or inferable from the composing process was conducted between that and the essay product itself. And you'll notice on the slide here that the composing process or the phase 2 analysis here is erratically outlined in some sort of digital crayon. And so, there it is for everyone. I did that because this is the phase in which I fell into that dark abyss of data analysis. I believe there's a jar of tears on my shelf in my office to memorialize just how confusing and awful that phase of my analysis really was. So please don't tell anyone on my committee I didn't know what I was doing there for a while. Of course, that's a joke too, because I believe half my committee is, on this pre-recorded call. So, but this is actually one of the pieces I wanted to emphasize in this talk, is that I think it's worth discussing that my initial counting of instances of codes for historical reasoning in these data sources didn't really tell me much. So here's 4 contextualizations over here in the essay. Here's 10 instances of contextualization over here in the process data. So what? These are very different sources of data. So comparing instances of codes or counting them was not productive. There was no connective tissue between them. And again, the focus of this study is whether and how the reasoning that they're doing in that composing process came to be represented in the essay. So it was at this point where it was clear that I needed a more qualitative analytical approach. And this is why I adopted analytical memos, which were used for the purposes of detailing a portrait of each individual student case. And this was one of those tools that I used, this analytical tool, to trace the reasoning that began in the composing process to its eventual fate in the essay. And I just want to give a kind of a shout out to Josh Radinsky, who was pivotal in untangling this mess. And that's not to understate how important my chair Susan has been in this process. But I did have one particular, I would say, awe-inspiring meeting with Josh that was especially useful in unsticking my then very stuck brain. You may recognize Josh's handwriting here. In leading up to the analytical memoing and the development of these individual cases, I met with Josh, and he helped really untangle this ball of yarn. I wanted to share this image because it really represents how a researcher needs to pull their head out of their own data and get some perspective. So here, actually what you see on the screen is Josh helping me trace out and represent the historical reasoning of one instance of one participant and trace it across multiple sources of data. I should have kind of imposed a layer on top of this, but really it was quite useful in representing it, even on a vertical surface, to just see it outside of my own head or my own spreadsheets, or really just get it outside of myself. So I just wanted to nod to that moment for a second, because it was, I think, critical in untangling this. So now you see in this erratically drawn phase 2, it's described very clearly. A comparative analysis was done of each case's process versus the essay. And then finally, phase 3, I looked across all the cases with respect to just the similarities and differences in historical reasoning that the data demonstrated. So let's kind of turn to the findings now. I'm sorry, it's been long awaited, a long wrap up. Hopefully the pitch isn't sour here. So I'd like to first talk about the essays. The findings from the analysis of the essay produced showed a high level of similarity in their structure, in the claims they advanced in the essays, and then also the parts of the documents the students used to support those claims with. So in other words, students largely used the very same quotations from the sources in the documents in their essays. They focused in on very specific things. So one of the sources that all the participants used in the study was with John Winthrop's a model of Christian charity, in which he talks about the New England colony, and he says this very iconic and famous line that they talked about in class, which is, "And we shall be a city upon a hill." And so as soon as students kind of saw that, they tended to hone in, and that's what became represented in their essay. So what you're looking at is a very basic breakdown of the students' thesis statements based on the primary claims that they advanced in the body of their essays. So claims were made about the difference in 3 societal systems: social, economic, and political, the colonists' motivations for migrating to each colony. So The motivations to move to New England were largely religious. The motivations of those traveling to Virginia were largely economic. And then finally, 2 students talked about geographic conditions in the area being a reason why those 2 colonies developed differently. So again, the prompt asked students to compare and contrast the 2 colonies as to why they developed differently. At the bottom here, what you're looking at is a kind of a typical example of how a student expressed multiple claims in a single thesis statement. Grace writes, although they came from the same place, these 2 distinct English societal colonies, so she's repeating the prompt, in the New England and Chesapeake regions were very different in the areas of motives, government, and how the societies developed. And I added that emphasis there because that was how the student organized their body paragraph, or the main content of their essay. They would have a paragraph about motives, then government, and then society. So that was a typical way in which students organized their claims. So all participants' essays contained at least some evidence of historical reasoning. They did it, people. They did some historical reasoning, although the extent to which they did that ranged in level and in sophistication and complexity. So participants' essays really fell into these, what I'm calling 3 different groups here. The first group, Rachel J. and Hannah, they successfully integrated the document information into the essay, and they used it as evidence of their claims. So they augmented the document information with their background knowledge, and they provided, very importantly, they provided reasoning for why that evidence supported that claim. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. The remaining participants, so groups 2 and 3, really less consistently used the sources as evidence of their claims, and they often didn't provide any explanation to warrant why the document information was evidence. So Grace, Mary, and Hannah's essay in the middle group, they inconsistently did that. They sometimes did, and they tended not to provide any explanation for their claims. And also, the groups 2 and 3 tended to include historical inaccuracies in their essays. So Haley and Randall advanced claims in their essays as well and demonstrated some reasoning, but they did so without citing specific information from the documents most often. And instead, they only provided a citation. So for example, a student might write, source 1, but they didn't really use the document. They just cited the document as evidence. So all that to say is, looking across the groups, more evidence of historical reasoning and more sophisticated historical reasoning was viewable from the first group than from the other essays, from the essays from the other participants. So just a quick, you don't have to read all this, but just a quick example from the essays participants, from the participants' essays. This is from group 1. So this is Rachel, a more sophisticated essay, and she demonstrated a range of reasoning across her essay, but this particular instance, she draws attention to the author's purpose and perspective of the intended audience of a source. So that was that the Puritans traveled with Winthrop on a ship. She inferred this information from the document, and she contextualized the document chronologically. So if you notice the highlighted portion, the bolded portion, she talks about John Winthrop, the document, and says, so he planted the seed, John Winthrop planted the seed that their society would work only if they were a city on a hill. And then she explains it further. She says, knowing that the Puritans were fearful of what awaited them in the New World, Winthrop, he spoke of their importance because they're an example and they should lead by example with no fear. So she goes to great lengths to explain why her quote supports her claim that the motivations of those people moving to New England were religious, and they were to stick together and be united. So her essay across the board is characterized by really successful integration of background knowledge, as well as sourcing and perspective taking. And she, I'm not going to detail her additional reasoning here, but she did more. The second group, here's an example, Ansie's essay. This is a good example of how the participants not in group 1 less consistently used the documents and didn't provide explanation for their claims. So She's referencing Governor Berkeley, which is document 6, a source, an excerpt. And she first includes a reference from another document that went unacknowledged and uncited. So she writes, Chesapeake settlers maintain a way of life by searching for gold. She's actually including details from a different source here, but she doesn't cite it at all. This is something that John Smith alluded to. They were searching for gold. But then she says, these are the people traveling to Virginia. She says they had a sense of community and had a governor, because there's a source in the document said about Virginia colony having a governor. So they had a governor, Berkeley, his name was, to maintain everything. So Berkeley still answered to a higher power, but he also had authority. So in a way, that's kind of a non-statement, an inference she's making about the document. In a way, kind of a non-committal statement. And then she also references the struggle at the end there with the Dutch and the Indians, which were mentioned in the Berkeley document. However, she demonstrated a limited ability to contextualize and take those events in the document and connect it to a larger argument or context. I would say this is a very good example of a student knowledge telling from a source rather than transforming it. She's taking things she can pick up from the source, lift from a source, and then drop it into her essay. And then finally, just a very short example from the last group. Here's from Randall's essay. Here's an example in which a citation is provided, but there is no document information from the documents to serve as evidence. So he writes, the New England immigrants consisted of mostly families, whereas the Virginia colonists were mostly men. So he cites document 3 and 4, which could in fact support that claim, although he doesn't include any information from the document to support that claim, nor does he go on to explain it. So here's an example of where it's just very limited in scope. So that's just a brief overlook of the essay. Now that you've had a taste of the kind of the essay corpus, I want to turn to the composing process data and give you a kind of a top level look at the participants' path through this whole task. So in producing the essays, here's some, pretty charts here that my wife spent weeks with me working on. In producing the essays, all the participants followed broadly the same approach and sequence to complete the task. So in general, as you sit down with the task, all students began by reading the prompt, then reading and annotating the documents. Then they moved towards some form of pre-writing, getting ready to write the essay, and then they wrote their essay. Seems like it's a pretty straightforward, simple composition process. However, some participants' paths through the task were more iterative than others, and they varied in terms of how much they engaged in pre-writing, when they did that, how long they did that, and then whether and how they returned to, did they go back to the sources in the document set and reread them at all while composing the essay. So you're looking at two of the students that produced higher quality essays, and this is their path through the task. They're not exactly alike. Both participants' paths were different through the problem space. So Jay engaged in, if you notice, a little more revision and didn't reread aloud any of the documents as he drafted the essay, whereas Rachel up top, you can see that she returned to the documents to reread portions of them and engaged in quite a bit of rereading of her essay while she was composing it. Two very different processes. So just a note about what you're looking at in these representations. This is based on really my first phase of analysis. So I used the lowest inferential coding as possible to characterize the students' reading and writing activities. So if students were literally reading aloud, that was coded as them reading aloud either the prompt or their essay or the document, versus perhaps pre-writing or actually composing their essay and then talking aloud about it. So the reason why you're seeing a lot of blank space is that this is representative of the comments of the protocols. This doesn't include comments in which participants were thinking aloud about reading. So the gaps in the reading is like they stopped reading and then they started talking aloud about that source. So again, this was low inferential as possible, just to represent generally what they did during the task. Here are Randall and Haley's paths. This is kind of the lower end of the spectrum. And they were in this third group and produced essays that lacked explanation and inconsistently used the documents. So note that they're generally similar in moving from prompt to reading to pre-writing, then drafting. But then you can also see that Haley returned to the documents while drafting the text of her essay, and then she did more rereading of her essay as she wrote it at multiple points, similar to what Rachel, one of the more exemplar students, did. So, what's the findings here, right? So, as predicted, all participants' process data revealed really a more complex picture of the reasoning that was evident in their essays, and this was as predicted. So this includes, sourcing. They did more complex sourcing, was visible in the process because they're talking about it. They're talking about the sources, and again, the essay itself is a distilled version of what this thinking was. So this was expected. They also engaged in a wide range of prior historical knowledge use to contextualize the documents they were reading, which wasn't necessarily apparent in the essays. And they also created a lot more historical comparisons during the process to compare the two colonies than actually ended up in the essays. Also, there were other processes that surfaced in the process that weren't apparent anywhere in the essay data. So some students engaged in historical perspective taking and historical empathy, corroboration of information across the documents. None of them really wrote to that end in their essays. And then there were a lot of chronological reasoning that they were doing to contextualize the documents that just, never would have, didn't appear in the essays at all. So let me introduce you to the students a little more clearly with some individual cases now. And I want to illustrate some of the reasoning that I've been talking about that kind of really represents how it didn't, these are cases of the reasoning not being represented in their essay, or it was distorted by the composition process. And I want to just warn you all that it looks like a lot of dense text coming up here. However, I'm going to really do my best to illustrate what you're looking at. So feel free to, unmute yourself and stop me to ask for clarification. But this is akin to these cases that I'm going to show you right now are akin to like skipping a rock across Lake Michigan. I'm going to show you really just one example from each participant of some of the more sophisticated reasoning that just wasn't transparent in their essay. If you really want to get the full story, feel free to check out my dissertation someday in the UIC library. Somebody will be happy to provide it to you. Just kidding. So Rachel's case. So I want to kind of go back to what I would call the most exemplary case of students of a student essay. Although her essay was the most complete and sophisticated, her composition process still demonstrated a more complete picture of the reasoning she engaged in. So in this example, her composing process demonstrated how she used chronological reasoning throughout the task for a variety of purposes, including to corroborate information across documents. And that corroboration piece was not seen across any of the participants' essays. So in this example, Rachel is looking at a list of immigrants, a list of people on a ship bound for the New England colony where the Puritans are. So this is the tightly knit religious community. And she notes on that list that there's a variety of occupations listed each person's name. And then she draws a connection between that variety and the first source, John Winthrop's goal of having this vision of unity for the community and the vision of them being a city on a hill. So in that first chunk of text, you can see highlighted in red, she's looking at this ship's list and she says they're basically having a variety of people coming to New England. So maybe I can connect that to the religion because of city on a hill. So they're going to be this unified community. So I remember that so she kind of goes on and kind of elaborates here. So she's already drawn kind of a connection between source 1 and source 3, this ship's list. Then later, she then considers how this unity contributed to the second source, which is the Articles of Agreement. And just a overview, it's an agreement written by 8 Puritan men in agreement to how to organize their Puritan community in New England. And she writes, immediately after she writes, maybe like connect that to document 2 so that everyone has their own land. That's kind of a quote from the Articles of Agreement. And share a meadow, like they have to share planting ground. So maybe I can quote that. And then here's where she goes a little metacognitive on us. She actually takes it a step back, and she demonstrates that she has a clear understanding of what she's being asked to do in this task of analyzing the documents. She was very intentional about it. And in doing so, she corroborated information, and then she built connections across 3 documents. So she says, what kind of an analysis can I do with that? That's in gray at the bottom. Maybe I can do context. Maybe I can connect it with purpose. So she's kind of going down this acronym of point of view, context. It's an acronym. It's a instructional scaffold that the teacher had used in the classroom to support their writing and analysis. And she says, so that can be connected at City on a Hill because he's saying that they're going to be a unified community. And 6 years later, when they made a set of laws, it shows that everyone's going to have to contribute to the community. So here she's really put together ideas across the 3 documents for New England in really, I think, a pretty sophisticated way. However, despite having a sophisticated essay, these connections do not arrive in her essay. At the very top, you can see one of the first things she said in her Think Aloud. She said, as she began the task, she says, so I'm supposed to have like this conversation with the sources instead of just relying on him. And that was exemplified really throughout her writing process. So I liked Rachel a lot. She was a fun case. But moving down the list, here's Jay's case. I just want to highlight one thing here. So here, Jay had initially drafted the thesis early on, and he wrote, the colonies developed differently into distinct political, social, and economic systems. He used kind of the boilerplate big 3 organizing frameworks. But then later, as he's done reading the documents, he says, I got to go back into the documents. I noticed that most of the documents have to do with social life, had a little bit to do with political in the beginning. And then he says, there's no real talk about the economy. He was more focused on the social difference. So he's recognizing, despite that he's put this framework in place for organizing his essay, he's boiling it down a little bit and realizing the sources don't necessarily speak to it. Now, you could make those arguments, like those documents do support those things, but he's not seeing it. So then he says, I'm trying to think how I could break this down. And then in red, he says, I could talk right now about town meetings and congressional aspects. So he's starting to draw on prior knowledge about the political aspects, how they had town meetings in New England and how Virginia had the House of Burgesses. So he has background knowledge that he's bringing to the task here. But then he's like, I feel like it's better organized if I save that. So he wants to save that information for later in his essay. And then here at the last excerpt here, he says, I'm going to change my thesis. I could just say distinct society. So he scribbles that out and he just reduces it. And then he says, I feel like I'm reaching too broad when I'm trying to fit in the political and economic systems. So this is what writers do all the time, right? They revise based on information. He's adapting to what he believes the sources are supporting. So that's a really nice historical process here. But this illustrates not only that he has additional background knowledge, but he was unable to connect that knowledge to the documents. So at the very end, during his post-task kind of debrief, he explains that he wanted to include background knowledge about the political and economic differences. So namely how Virginia had a legislative body named the House of Burgesses. He also wanted to talk about the role of tobacco in Virginia, so another economic boon for Virginia. But the documents didn't support it. He said, I was thrown for a loop when most of the documents were just about societal aspects. So again, he didn't make the connection, but he also had additional background knowledge that he wished to include. So I'm just going to highlight a quick case of chronological reasoning here, just to give you an idea or a flavor of what it looks like. This is Hannah's case. This is just 3 quick little blips from when she's reading the sources. At the beginning, she reads the details of the first source. So she says, it's a model of Christian charity, not clarity, but charity, written aboard the Yellow Barrel. So she's reading the details about the John Winthrop source. And then she says, so this was settled after and then she trails off. And so what she was referring to there is she actually circles the date. This is one of those cases where the video data was especially useful. She circles, annotates the date 1630 as she read it. And notice that it was after the Jamestown settlement was established. So here she's doing a little chronological like reasoning of her own. She's situating this source in relation to an anchor event that she knew occurred earlier in 1607. And so although she just does this in a kind of a brief moment here, she perpetually does this across the sources that she reads. So she gets to the second document and she says it's a little bit after the first document. So she's positioning them in relation to each other. And then in document 4, she says, in the think aloud portion, she says, it's kind of the same year as document 3, but for Virginia. So she knows the sources are kind of moving over to the Virginia side, but she notes it's the same time period. I want to note that Hannah's essay doesn't show evidence of her chronological reasoning, and nor would you necessarily expect it to, because the prompt didn't necessarily explicitly ask them to make a chronological argument. Grace also corroborated and engaged in chronological reasoning. She talks about how after, so in the Berkeley document, when she gets to Nathaniel Bacon and his manifesto, she noticed that it's 3 years after Berkeley needed help for the war with the Indians. So here's an example of where she, again, just positions Grace, a different case, positions the document in relationship to another. That's not present in the essays as well. And she also notes in the last segment here, additional background knowledge. She notes that New England had problems with the Indians too. They had King Philip's War and they fought together, they bound together to fight the Native Americans. So just like in Virginia. So here's an instance in which she notices that these colonies are similar in a way, but it doesn't arrive in the essay. She doesn't revisit this thought as she moves on. So really just the last two kind of, again, a skip across the water here. Here's Mary, and I want to show you an excerpt from her essay to give you an idea of what the essay looks like versus what she thought about during the process of writing. So after reading John Winthrop, she says, I noticed that he constantly mentions we as a sense of connecting himself to his audience. So I'm thinking that his audience are the people who are on board the ship with him, on the board of the Arabella. That's his main audience. So he's connecting himself to his audience to get a closer feel to them. So here she's like doing some complex sourcing. She's attending to his language use and his perspective. And if you look down at what she ultimately does in her essay, so you notice in the middle there, she says, I feel like this whole document, so she starts boiling the document down. She says, I feel like this whole document is basically like Winthrop saying, we have to stick together. We have to be that city on a hill. So that's her, even though she does this rich reasoning as she reads the source, she simmers it down, or essentializes it, sorry. She simmers it down and distills that reasoning into what you see below, which is the main religious concept from the Puritans' belief was a city on a hill. As written by John Winthrop, the main focus was to stay unified, be connected as a distinct society, and this society would be a model for a city on a hill. She uses that to contrast with the other colonies. So she uses the source correctly, but notice how the essay itself masks the richness of what she's actually doing to arrive at that final product. And similarly, Ansi does the same thing. I'm gonna skip Ansi. Well, I'm gonna skip one of these cases because I don't want to like belabor the points here any more than I already have. But if you notice just in the red text here, Ansi also attends to the perspective. So Ansi is one of these essays where she really just did a lot of knowledge telling, and it wasn't a sophisticated essay, but she notes in the first segment, he's the founder, well, Winthrop is the founder of the New England region, so she's recognizing the significance of the author of the source. She also says, she creates a comparison here, and she says, a significant difference between the Chesapeake and the New England would be that they had different motives of settling. She doesn't communicate that in the essay well. And then she attends to his language use as well. Winthrop keeps saying we stay together. He says we stay, he says together, he says are multiple times. So she notes that like they want to stick together. She's noticing how Winthrop's language is emphasizing that. This point is not emphasized or even apparent in her essay. And then when John Winthrop said, at the very end here, she says, well, then 3 years later or 6 years later, the Articles of Agreement was written and signed by 8 church men. So then she's engaging chronology and corroboration and trying to make sense of her first point with the second source. And it's just amazing how these connections, as it translates into the writing process or into the essay, it's reduced. So as you see in her essay, this is what it becomes. She says, the community was built around the church, which was in the center of the community, along with the school, fulfilling John Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill. So she in her after all this, her essay reflects a narrow, a centralized version of her thinking, and it does not accurately reflect the reasoning she engaged in during the Think Aloud. So finally, Haley's case here. She again wrote a very kind of reduced, the shortest essay of the entire set. And I just want to point out a historical comparison and some rich background knowledge that she brought to the task that she abandoned. The claim never appeared in her essay. So she writes in red, they were guided, this is the immigrants to New England, they were guided with this idea of living as models so they could be that city on a hill, while the Virginia colonists were all kind of like for the self-government theme. And she explains that later in her Think Aloud. What she's referring to is the House of Burgesses, which is this piece of background knowledge she brought to the task about Virginia, about how they had self-government, they had kind of an order. And she says, how would I say that? And then later she says, I can build on that and talk about this later in the essay. I'm going to save it to build up to this idea that they were all for self-government. But then what it boils down to here is, it doesn't appear in the essay. And then finally, really the last one, I apologize for the belabored, dense text. I want to begin with the essay excerpt and work backwards. This final case with Randall claims that those in the Virginia colony struggled to survive and that they accepted help from Native Americans, whereas those in New England were better off because they were united and they had family life, so they didn't struggle as much. So he puts this claim in here. He does not use any evidence from the documents to support this claim or reference any documents here, but he basically compares the two colonies. He advances this claim. So after drafting that comparison during the process, after he drafts that without citing evidence, he actually says, well, now I'm second guessing myself. Maybe that was actually a New England colony. It wasn't and then he says King Philip's War. So, and if you don't know the background, I need to explain that King Philip War was a war fought in New England colonies in which it wasn't all peachy keen for the New England colonists early on. And so he's realizing, based on his background knowledge, that this could have been a similarity for both. Both colonies were similar in that respect with the Indians. They both struggled with the Indians. So, what would you do in this situation? Would you erase your claim that is now been defunct by this new knowledge that's come to light in your brain? Or would you, what would you do? Well, if you're an 11th grade student, I think the easiest answer is, I'm going to get this thing over with. And so actually he expressed frustration. He noted that he didn't feel like he used the documents well. And he's like, I'm going on to my conclusion, and so he moved on. And so if you made assumptions about his reasoning from the essay itself, this is actually a case in which it's distorted. It's actually inaccurately representing the thinking that he did during the process. So I've given you like a blitz of each individual case. And so I kind of want to summarize here for you the cross case patterns that emerged across all these participants. And these are patterns of historical reasoning that were consistently visible in the students' essays that were not in the essay products. So as I mentioned, all the participants demonstrated more reasoning than in the essay, and that was expected, but 3 patterns of reasoning were visible in the process that weren't in the product. So first, participants generally excluded or deleted comparisons, so relevant to answering the prompt, and background knowledge that they brought to bear during the task throughout the process that didn't get included in their essays. And in some instances, we have explanation as to why. They say, I don't think the document supported it. So they excluded prior relevant knowledge, like task relevant prior knowledge from the sources, and set it aside and wrote more of a distilled essay. Also, they engaged in a number of chronological reasoning process. 6 of the participants did so during the process and engaged in some form of chronological reasoning, but evidence of reasoning in the essays were limited to really 2 participants, and they were fairly limited in scope. The process reveals a much richer purpose for that reasoning, really to contextualize the documents and their argument. And then finally, 6 of the 8 participants demonstrated really strong evidence of corroboration during the composition process. However, none of the essays demonstrated that students were making these connections across the various documents in the document set. So just some quick discussion points before I finish and open it up for questions. So one of the kind of findings here is that all participants advanced multiple claims, accurate claims in their essays. That's not disputed. They all of them did that to some extent, but not all the participants routinely or consistently used the information from the documents as evidence to support their claims. So participants who warranted their claims, those in really the first group and a little bit in the second, demonstrated more evidence in their essays of their historical reasoning. Also, over the course of the composing process, during the process, several participants shifted their focus from analyzing richly these sources of the documents to then moving towards just finding ways to include the documents or information from the documents in their essay. So again, instead of focusing on the analysis that could be used to substantiate the claims, their goal became to identify really any information that they could work into the essay. So this is a good example of, it appears that students defaulted to knowledge telling and include information from and about documents instead of transforming it, even though they were doing some of that during the process. Finally, the study suggests that while historical essays, are really useful for seeing some aspects and dimensions of reasoning, the reasoning that comes to be represented only provides, I think, traces of the fuller range of reasoning they created, they engaged in to create that. And so another kind of finding suggests that the discrepancies between the process versus the product, they were greater for those whose essays were weaker or more incomplete. And I think this point holds really some instructional implications, because outcomes for students in the history classroom would be less favorable for students that struggle to express their thinking in writing, and it would be more favorable for students that don't. And so I think this really suggests that students should have opportunities to make their thinking and reasoning known in multiple ways, in classroom discussions, for example, or debates, beyond just the written essay. But also, I'm a big fan of composition and writing. We need to do a better job of supporting students in their historical writing to help them translate their thinking from this process to the final product itself. So Don Wink, a few years ago, when I gave my first talk on this topic, when I was presenting preliminary results, he was talking to me in the lobby afterwards, and he's like, so what's your kind of, what's the big, what's the like 3-word, short takeaway from your study? And, this was after the talk, and I kind of quipped, well, I think kids suck at writing. And, he laughed and he said, I really want to make sure you work that into your final dissertation defense, that kids suck at writing like this. That should be your takeaway. Make sure you end with that. And I thought it might be inappropriate for a committee, but I might let it slide. I might get it by now, given a little bit more of the informality of this talk. And so I think that's also a takeaway. It's something I'm passionate about, which is we need to do more to support students in translating the rich thinking that we know they're capable of doing through instruction, and translating that into these forms that we value in society, like written products.